There's no denying that Michael Jordan is the greatest player to ever play on a basketball court. His flawless perfection on the court was often combined with a great personality and impressive marketing off the court. But what if the GOAT returned to the modern? Would he still be the dominant force we know him to be? You see, many of us might be too young to truly grasp the phenomenon that was Michael Jordan. Ask anyone of the older generation and they'll be quick to point out how he would captivate the NBA fans and players alike. Jordan set the league alight with breathtaking dunks and his flying heroics, not to mention clutch performances that earned him the title of GOAT. So what would happen if the most impressive player ever to step foot on a basketball court returned to the game he loved today? In fact, there have been many rumors in the late 2010s, but unfortunately, these never really came to fruition. So let's see what would happen.
Rodman looking for a cutter. Pippen is open to the arc. The drop for Jordan and the fadeaway.
Stepped it out to Jordan, down the lane, all the way. Basket, he put it in. Well, he's got him standing.
You see, one misconception is that Michael Jordan never really had any real competition to face. In fact, he was often seen playing against some of the notable Hall of Famers like Charles Barkley, Karl Malone, Clyde Drexler, and Patrick Ewing, all players who were dominant forces of their own, but never really reached the same heights as Jordan.
Here's Jordan for three. Yes!
Turns up the heat. Still 6 seconds to go, though Michael actually shot it a little soon.
But what made the GOAT stand out even more is the fact that he showed up to the NBA at exactly the right moment, and the NBA needed someone to put them over the edge with fans and in the mainstream world. In fact, two things happened at the time when Jordan showed up, and both of these elevated his status. Technology was just starting to take off, with games being shown more frequently on television. Additionally, Nike was slowly growing and becoming a real force in the world of athletics. By capitalizing on these things at the right time, Michael Jordan would find himself standing apart from the rest of the competition.
Tried to catch him.
57 to play first quarter. They clear out Michael Jordan on Vinny. He goes baseline, hit a high glasser in a hurry.
Michael with time winding down against Maxwell. Jordan nails it.
Back then, brands were also trying to associate themselves with the right people, and being so popular, Michael Jordan would be one of the first faces and names that players would turn to. In fact, he would be the catalyst for players like LeBron and Kobe to become international superstars, with names that would be synonymous with specific brands. To say that basketball was not mainstream in the 80s and 90s might seem ridiculous. However, if you look back, players were never really the main focus. Yes, you had someone like Michael Jordan stand out, but the focus was mostly on the teams, and sponsors would try to back the best teams. However, a few years prior, there was a man in the world of boxing that would become bigger than the sport. You might have heard of Muhammad Ali.
I told you I'm the real champion. I told you I'm the champion of the world. All of you bow.
If he goes down again, it's over. Ali is the knockout winner at 2 minutes and 3.
You see, Ali was not only a great boxer, but he possessed one thing that none of the other boxers around him would have. This one thing would be charisma. Now, aside from the superior skills and high-flying athleticism that Jordan showed, he had the same level of charisma that Ali brought to the table. Once you have such levels of charisma, you become truly marketable, and sponsors will want to plaster your face all over their television screens to sell more of their product. During the 90s, Nike was the first to capitalize on this, striking a deal with Jordan to release the first signature shoe, Air Jordan 1, centered around the colors of the Chicago Bulls and disrupting the status quo of white sneakers. In fact, disrupting this status quo became so big that the NBA would go on and fine Jordan $5,000 per game, as the shoes had to be 51% white. However, Nike welcomed the controversy and simply paid the fines, but it was the controversial storylines that would have people flocking to stores in search of this sneaker. Nike would even go as far as producing a commercial over the controversial ban on these sneakers. But while the NBA was banning the shoes, people were tuning into their televisions each game to see if he would be wearing them. This ultimately turned a star of the game into a superstar with the name Michael Jordan, now on the lips of almost every person in America and making great stories for the tabloids. In fact, this opened the door for other mainstream brands like Coca-Cola, McDonald's, and Gatorade to get their marketing across. Finally, this set up Jordan to become the most popular player to ever play the game.
And Jordan for three.
be a 50, but he took off just a little inside that.
Michael. Backing Maxwell. Falls away under pressure and hits.
However, his record speaks for itself. You see, Jordan was made famous by the rise of media attention at the time. However, his records and accomplishments can often not be rivaled. Magic Johnson once said, "There's Michael Jordan, and then there's the rest of us." During his time at the top of the NBA mountain, Jordan would go on to become a Rookie of the Year, 6-time NBA champion, 6-time NBA Finals MVP, 10-time All-NBA First Team, 9-time NBA All-Defensive First Team, Defensive Player of the Year, 14-time NBA All-Star, 3-time NBA All-Star MVP, 50th Anniversary All-Time Team, and 10 scoring titles. Jordan would even retire with the highest scoring average of 30.1 points per game, while finally making it into the NBA Hall of Fame. You see, the way Michael Jordan played at the time was simply something that no one could fathom or defend against. He would go on to set numerous records that often became the measuring stick by which players in the NBA would be measured. If we look at the modern game, we can quickly see that almost any player looking to achieve something is often compared to Jordan. And for more than 2 decades, we've been waiting for someone to step up and perhaps become the next Michael Jordan. However, many doubters would often say that in a modern game, there's no way Michael Jordan would be the elite athlete that he was back in the 80s and 90s.
Misses. Bulls can cut it to 1 if they score. Here's Jordan down the middle all the way.
Up his mind to concentrate on offense. Jordan over Hawkins.
Michael given room.
Some suggest that the modern post-2000s class would often overshadow him and that players have been studying the GOAT. But while Jordan might not have had such a tough time back during his prime years, it can be said that things have changed a lot. Today we have incredible stars with modern training and elite coaching. So how would the GOAT measure in the modern NBA? We need to remember that Michael Jordan is now older and his age would make it virtually impossible to make a sensational comeback. However, if he was in his prime today, things could be different. You see, just after the Jordan era, players like Shaquille O'Neal, Kobe Bryant, Tim Duncan, LeBron James, Kevin Garnett, Kevin Durant, and Dwayne Wade all had successful careers.
The rebound to Shaw. There goes Green. There goes Kobe. Kobe slam. Basket counts. Foul.
Over the glass, Kobe! Give me a break! Welcome to the circus.
Ginobili. Duncan steps back. Duncan drives. Duncan backs it in. Defending champion Nuggets. 2 minutes gone here in the fourth. LeBron James 3. Good!
By Andre. Garnett wide open. 5 on the clock. Fires and fills it. Scored the last.
Nurkic made a 3, and that one's off. Durant snatches and scores.
Wade for 3. Kaboom!
In fact, these players never had to encounter the monster that was Michael Jordan during his time.
Jordan putting moves on Russell. We're down to 2. Now to 1. Here's Jordan. Backing Hornacek. Here's Jordan. Yes.
However, Jordan also didn't have to encounter them at their primes. Today, players are much faster and stronger, and it's quite interesting to think how Jordan would defend the monstrous Shaq, or even someone who had the consistency of Kobe, especially if these two players were to be on the same team. We think that in the modern era, there are simply too many players that are great, and while Jordan might not have been the star he was back in the day, he would still be a household name. In fact, Jordan would still become a top player, perhaps even teaming up with some of these other players to create an insane team that would dominate the league. In essence, Jordan would basically achieve the stardom of someone like LeBron James, and many would be directly comparing these two players. However, each year we see fewer and fewer players reach the ultimate GOAT ranking among the pundits, which tells us that it's becoming increasingly harder, and Michael Jordan would no doubt have to deal with this. But being such a talented player does mean he would be a household name and inducted into the Hall of Fame. Or do you think he would be kept in check by some of the other top players? Make sure to let us know in the comments.